924, England was not yet the unified kingdom later generations would take for granted. When Edward the Elder died, the political structure he had helped build was suddenly exposed to the possibility of collapse. Mercia and Wessex had been brought together under Edward and his father, Alfred, but they were not simply two names on a map. They were distinct political communities with their own elites, interests, and loyalties. And when the throne became vacant, those differences immediately became dangerous. The Mercians supported Edward's eldest son, Æthelstan. The political elite of Wessex preferred another candidate, Alfred, who was younger but had stronger connections among the southern power brokers. For a moment, the achievement of the previous generation seemed reversible. The kingdom could have split back into competing political centers. That crisis was resolved without a civil war. Alfred died before the succession could be settled through a direct confrontation, and Æthelstan was eventually accepted as ruler by both Mercia and Wessex. His coronation at Kingston upon Thames was itself a political statement. The site stood on the boundary between the two traditions, allowing Æthelstan to present himself not as the king of one half of the realm, but as the ruler of both. That gave him something his predecessors had been trying to construct for decades, a larger political base. But it did not give him complete security. The most difficult problem lay to the north. York remained an important Scandinavian political center, connected to the wider Viking world across the Irish Sea. Its rulers could draw on relationships extending far beyond the borders of the English kingdom. As long as York remained outside direct English control, the northern frontier remained a source of strategic uncertainty. Æthelstan responded quickly. He did not simply wait for York to become a threat. He moved first. When King Sitric of York died in 927, the political balance around the city became unstable. The leading men of York summoned Guthrum of Dublin to take the throne and preserve the connection between York and Dublin. But before Guthrum could arrive, an English army was already moving north. Æthelstan captured York. Its earls, merchants, and archbishop were forced to submit to him. And Guthrum, who had been expected to inherit the city, was left without a kingdom. This was more than another battlefield success. York had been a political link between northern Britain and the Irish Sea world. By taking the city, Æthelstan disrupted that connection and moved the frontier of English power much farther north. Then he went farther still. At Emont Bridge, kings from Scotland, Strathclyde, Bamborough, and Wales came before him and accepted terms that went well beyond symbolic recognition. They were expected to provide military assistance, pay tribute, avoid cooperation with the Vikings, and attend Æthelstan's council when summoned. This was an extraordinary expansion of political reach. Æthelstan was no longer simply defending an English kingdom. He was attempting to impose a hierarchy across Britain. And for a time it worked. His authority expanded. His enemies were divided. His northern rivals had fewer independent options. His alliances stretched beyond Britain as well, connecting him to powerful continental dynasties through marriages, diplomacy, and political relationships. By the 930s, Æthelstan had built something much larger than the kingdom he had inherited. But there was a problem hidden inside that success. The more territory Æthelstan controlled, the more northern rulers had to accept a political order designed by someone else. The more obligations he imposed, the less room those rulers had to pursue their own interests. And the more powerful England became, the more dangerous it became for any one northern ruler to resist it alone. That changed the strategic problem. Æthelstan had spent the first years of his reign making his enemies weaker as individual powers. But by doing so, he was also giving them a reason to stop acting individually. And that was the transformation that would lead to Brunanburh. Because once separate rulers begin to discover that they share the same threat, the next question is no longer who can defeat England alone. It is whether they can defeat it together. York was the hinge on which Æthelstan's northern strategy turned. As long as the city remained connected to the wider Scandinavian world, England's northern frontier could never be treated as permanently secure. Its importance was not simply geographic. York was a political center. It connected rulers and merchants across the north of England and the Irish Sea. Whoever controlled it possessed more than another fortified settlement. They possessed access to networks that could bring influence, manpower, and political legitimacy across the water. That was why Æthelstan moved so quickly when Sitric died in 927. Sitric's death created a succession problem in York. Guthrum of Dublin was summoned to take the throne, potentially preserving the York-Dublin connection that could have allowed Scandinavian power to remain anchored in northern England. Æthelstan did not wait for that arrangement to take shape. His army moved north. York fell into English hands before Guthrum could arrive, and the city's leading men were forced to accept Æthelstan as their ruler. Guthrum returned to Dublin without the kingdom he had expected to inherit. The immediate military operation was therefore also a political operation. Æthelstan had removed a potential rival before that rival could establish himself. More importantly, he had broken a connection. York had been part of a wider Scandinavian political world. Now the city was tied directly to Æthelstan. That changed what northern rulers could realistically do. A Scottish king could no longer assume that York would remain an independent counterweight to Wessex. A ruler in Strathclyde could no longer treat the English frontier as a problem confined to the south. And rulers connected to the Irish Sea now had to account for an English king whose reach had moved much farther north. Æthelstan understood that military conquest alone was not enough. A city could be captured and lost again. The wider political environment had to be changed. That is why the next stage of his expansion relied on submission rather than immediate annexation. At Emont Bridge, 5 kings came to meet him: Constantine of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, Ealdred of Bamborough, and Welsh rulers including Hywel of West Wales and Owain of Gwynedd. They accepted Æthelstan's authority and undertook obligations that extended beyond a ceremonial oath. They were expected to provide military support when required. They were expected to pay tribute. They were expected to avoid cooperation with Viking enemies. And they were expected to attend Æthelstan's councils when summoned. In other words, Æthelstan was attempting to create a political system in which northern rulers remained on their own thrones but operated within limits set by the English king. That was an efficient way to expand power. It avoided the enormous administrative burden of directly governing every territory. Instead of replacing every ruler, Æthelstan could turn those rulers into subordinate partners. The arrangement also gave him something strategically valuable: time. He could use the authority of the English crown without having to occupy every mile of the territory over which that authority was claimed. For several years, this system appeared remarkably successful. Æthelstan's authority expanded. His borders grew. His influence reached across Britain. And his diplomatic network extended into continental Europe through fosterage and marriage alliances. From the perspective of the English king, the results looked ideal. He had transformed the political map without having to fight constantly. But the same system contained a structural weakness. Æthelstan's authority depended on the willingness of subordinate rulers to remain subordinate. An oath could establish a relationship. It could not erase the interests of the man who swore it. Tribute could demonstrate submission. It could not make a Scottish ruler stop wanting independence. Military obligations could bind a king to Æthelstan's campaigns. They could not guarantee that he would accept English dominance forever. That distinction became increasingly important because Æthelstan was not simply asking these rulers to recognize his prestige. He was changing the distribution of power. Every concession they made reduced their freedom of action. Every English victory narrowed their options. And every new obligation made the northern political order more dependent on Æthelstan's continued strength. This is where expansion began producing its own strategic reaction. Imagine the choice facing a northern ruler before Æthelstan's expansion. Resist England alone. Negotiate with England. Maintain an independent relationship with other northern powers. Each option remained possible. But after York fell, after oaths were imposed, after tribute and military obligations were established, the option space became narrower. Resistance alone became more dangerous. Cooperation with other powers became more valuable. And the rulers who had previously competed with one another now had a shared reason to reconsider those rivalries. This did not mean they suddenly trusted one another. It meant they increasingly had a common problem. Æthelstan had become strong enough that defeating him separately was becoming unrealistic. And once that happens, a coalition becomes a rational response even among political actors who would normally prefer to remain rivals. That is the mechanism that matters. The coalition that eventually gathered against Æthelstan did not appear out of nowhere. It was a response to a changed political environment. Æthelstan's victories had altered the available choices of everyone around him. The English king had spent the first years of his reign reducing the number of independent powers capable of challenging him. Now those surviving powers had an incentive to combine what remained of their strength. The danger for Æthelstan was not that one enemy had suddenly become stronger. It was that his own success had changed the way several enemies interacted with one another. For years, England had been dealing with separate northern problems. Now those problems were beginning to converge. And by 937, that convergence would produce something Æthelstan had not previously faced. A coalition large enough to force him into a war on terms he could not simply dictate. Taking York was only the first step. If Æthelstan wanted northern Britain to remain secure, he had to turn conquest into a political relationship that could survive without an English army standing in every territory. That meant overlordship. The system was simple in principle. Local rulers could remain kings, but their freedom of action would be limited by their relationship with Æthelstan. At Emont Bridge, several northern and Welsh rulers accepted his authority. The arrangement required more than ceremonial submission. They were expected to provide military support, pay tribute, avoid cooperation with Viking enemies, and attend the English King's Council when summoned. This was a remarkably efficient way to extend power. Æthelstan did not need to replace every local ruler. He needed those rulers to behave as though his strategic interests had become their own. That reduced the immediate cost of conquest. A king who accepted Æthelstan's authority could continue governing his own people, but he would now do so inside an expanding hierarchy whose highest authority sat in England. The arrangement also created a military advantage. If Æthelstan needed troops, subordinate rulers could be expected to provide them. If a Viking threat emerged, northern kingdoms were no longer free to cooperate with it. If a ruler wanted to preserve his position, recognizing Æthelstan's authority became a safer option than openly resisting him. This was not direct imperial administration. It was something more flexible. Æthelstan was building a network of dependent political relationships, and for several years that network appeared to work. His influence stretched across the north and west. He brought kings into his orbit. He strengthened his authority through councils and tribute. He also built a network of relationships beyond Britain through fosterage, diplomacy, and marriage alliances with major European dynasties. The picture was impressive. England had become more than a collection of territories under one crown. It was becoming the center of a wider political system. But that system contained an important weakness. Æthelstan's authority was strongest when everyone believed he could enforce it. The entire structure depended on the credibility of English power. An oath meant little if the king who demanded it could not punish its violation. Tribute was meaningful because refusing to pay carried consequences. Military obligations worked because Æthelstan possessed the ability to compel compliance. So the system was not simply based on consent. It rested on a mixture of prestige, advantage, and coercive credibility. As long as that balance held, the arrangement was efficient. But it also changed the incentives of the rulers living inside it. A subordinate king did not stop having his own interests just because he had sworn an oath. He still wanted his own territory, his own dynasty, his own influence, his own freedom of action. And every additional demand from Æthelstan increased the value of recovering that freedom. This is why political submission is not the same thing as political integration. A ruler can accept another king's authority because resisting is too expensive. That does not mean he has abandoned the desire to regain independence. For Æthelstan, the distinction may not have seemed urgent while the system was functioning. His military superiority was enough to keep the hierarchy intact. But his success was producing another effect. The more rulers he brought under his authority, the more they shared an experience that previously had been separate. They were all living under the expansion of the same power. That common experience could become a basis for cooperation. And the northern political world contained something else that made that cooperation possible. These rulers did not have to become friends. They only had to decide that their immediate interests overlapped. For Olaf of Dublin, the loss of York created an obvious motive. York had been a valuable political center, and its capture damaged the wider Scandinavian position in northern Britain. For Constantine of Scotland, the problem was different. His kingdom was still independent, but Æthelstan's expanding authority placed limits on that independence. The oath at Emont Bridge had already demonstrated how far English power had reached. A king who had once been able to act independently now had obligations to a ruler farther south. For Strathclyde and other northern powers, the same expansion created another concern. The English king was no longer simply one regional ruler among many. He was becoming the center of a hierarchy that could eventually determine the strategic choices available to everyone around him. That is how an expanding power can unintentionally create a coalition. Not because every opponent shares the same objective, but because each opponent begins to lose options under the same dominant system. At the beginning of Æthelstan's reign, a northern ruler could resist England and still maintain relationships with other independent powers. After York fell and northern overlordship expanded, that became more difficult. A ruler could resist, but isolation became more dangerous. A ruler could cooperate, but only by accepting English conditions. Or several rulers could coordinate and change the balance. The third option was increasingly attractive. This is the hidden mechanism behind the coalition. Æthelstan's expansion did not simply make England stronger. It changed the option space of the people around England. And once their options narrowed far enough, coordination became rational. The irony is that Æthelstan's political system was working. His enemies were becoming less powerful individually. His authority was expanding. His obligations were being obeyed. His influence was spreading. But the stronger that system became, the more valuable cooperation among its remaining opponents became. By the middle of the 930s, the northern question was therefore no longer, which kingdom might challenge Æthelstan next? It was becoming, what happens when several kingdoms stop challenging him separately? That was the strategic transformation that made Brunanburh possible. And when that coalition finally moved south in 937, Æthelstan would discover just how different a unified enemy was from the individual rivals he had spent years defeating. For several years, Æthelstan's system appeared to be doing exactly what a successful political system should do. It weakened his rivals, it expanded his influence, and it made England more secure. But there was a difference between making individual enemies weaker and making the entire northern political environment stable. Those are not the same thing. A ruler who defeats several opponents separately may appear to be eliminating threats one by one. But if those defeats teach the surviving opponents that they cannot win alone, the strategic effect can become the opposite. Instead of competing with one another, they begin to compare their losses. Instead of asking which kingdom should resist England, they begin asking whether all of them should resist England together. That was the problem Æthelstan's expansion was creating. York had already demonstrated what English military intervention could do. The city had been taken before Guthrum of Dublin could establish himself, breaking the political connection that might otherwise have preserved a Scandinavian power center in northern England. Then came the wider network of submission. At Emont Bridge, rulers from Scotland, Strathclyde, Bamborough, and Wales accepted obligations to the English king. They were expected to provide military assistance, pay tribute, and avoid cooperation with Viking enemies. From Æthelstan's perspective, this was evidence of success. From the perspective of those rulers, it was evidence of how far English power had expanded. That distinction matters. The same event can represent security for one side and strategic danger for another. Æthelstan could see a network of loyal or subordinate rulers. His northern neighbors could see a network in which their freedom of action was shrinking. That created a common pressure even where their interests remained different. Olaf had a particularly obvious reason to oppose the new order. The loss of York had deprived his dynasty of a major political foothold in Britain. Recovering the city would therefore mean reversing one of Æthelstan's most important northern victories. Constantine faced a different problem. His kingdom had not been conquered, but he had already accepted Æthelstan's authority. He had sworn an oath. He had accepted obligations. And he had seen firsthand what happened when English military power was directed north. For him, the issue was no longer whether Scotland could survive as an independent kingdom. It was how much independence remained under an increasingly dominant English king. Those interests did not make Olaf and Constantine natural allies. One was a Scandinavian ruler linked to Dublin and York. The other was a Scottish king. Their political traditions, religious environments, and ambitions were not identical. But strategic cooperation does not require identical interests. It requires overlapping interests that are strong enough to overcome the cost of cooperation. By the middle of the 930s, that condition increasingly existed. Æthelstan had become the dominant power. The individual kingdoms around him had become less capable of resisting him separately. And that meant the value of coordination was rising. This is a recurring pattern in international politics. When one power becomes strong enough to threaten each neighboring state individually, those neighbors may begin to cooperate even if they would normally compete with one another. The stronger the dominant power becomes, the stronger the incentive for balancing can become. Æthelstan's kingdom was therefore producing a balancing response. His enemies did not need to believe that England was invincible. They only needed to believe that defeating England separately was becoming too expensive. That was enough. The coalition that emerged in 937 was therefore not evidence that Æthelstan's expansion had failed. It was evidence that his expansion had become consequential enough to change the behavior of the states around him. That is an important difference. A weak power rarely creates a large coalition against itself. A dominant power can, because dominance changes the incentives of everyone else. Æthelstan had crossed that threshold, and now the political map was becoming more dangerous precisely because he had made England stronger. The coalition did not appear as a single army overnight. Its members had different routes into the conflict. Olaf brought forces from Dublin and the wider Irish Sea World. Scottish and northern forces contributed their own contingents. Sea kings, raiders, and other fighters were attracted by the opportunity for plunder and war. That diversity created an obvious weakness. A coalition made from different groups can be difficult to coordinate. Its commanders have different priorities. Its soldiers have different reasons for fighting. Its members may agree on whom they oppose without agreeing on what should happen afterward. But before those problems could matter, the coalition had one advantage: scale. Æthelstan had spent years defeating rivals individually. Now he faced the combined resources of several political worlds. The invasion came from multiple directions. Olaf crossed the Irish Sea. The northern forces moved south. Their objective was not merely to raid England. They wanted to bring Æthelstan to battle, defeat him, and overturn the political order he had established in the north. For the first time in years, Æthelstan was reacting to someone else's timetable. That alone represented a major strategic change. Until then, he had usually been the actor imposing the problem. Now the coalition was imposing the problem on him. And the first information reaching Æthelstan was alarming. The Vikings had returned. The Scots had joined them. The northern powers he thought he had brought under control were cooperating again. And the invading force was larger than the English army immediately available to confront it. Æthelstan had built a system powerful enough to dominate Britain. Now that system was being tested by the reaction it had created. The question was no longer whether England could defeat any one northern enemy. It was whether the English king could adapt quickly enough to defeat all of them together. That was the crisis that brought the armies toward the Wirral. And for the first time in Æthelstan's reign, the king who had spent years narrowing his enemies' options found his own options narrowing with them. The northern coalition was powerful. But it was not unified in the way a modern state might be unified. There was no single northern government, no common bureaucracy, no permanent military command, no shared political identity. What brought these forces together was simpler. They had begun to share an interest in reversing the same expansion. That distinction matters because alliances are often misunderstood as evidence that their members suddenly agree about everything. They do not. They agree about the problem. For Olaf of Dublin, the problem had a name: York. The city had once provided a base for Scandinavian power in northern Britain. After Sihtric's death, Olaf's wider political network had an opportunity to preserve that connection. But Æthelstan moved first and took York before Guthrith could establish himself. For Olaf, therefore, the English expansion was not abstract. It represented a direct loss of political territory and influence. Recovering York was a concrete objective. Constantine's situation was different. He was king of Scotland. His kingdom had not been absorbed into Æthelstan's realm, but he had already accepted English overlordship and obligations after Æthelstan's northern expansion. The relationship had therefore moved from simple coexistence to something much more restrictive. Constantine had to consider a future in which Scottish independence remained formally intact but increasingly constrained by a stronger southern king. That created a powerful incentive. If Scotland could resist England alone, it might eventually restore a wider margin of independence. But if it could not, then cooperation with other northern powers became more attractive. And that is exactly where the interests of Olaf and Constantine overlapped. Olaf wanted York. Constantine wanted to escape a political order increasingly dominated by Æthelstan. The objectives were different. The enemy was the same. That was enough. Other forces joined for their own reasons. The Viking world of the Irish Sea included sea kings, raiders, and ambitious war leaders who could see an opportunity for wealth, status, and military success in attacking England. The coalition therefore included men whose motivations extended beyond the political objectives of its leading rulers. This made the alliance larger. It also made it more complicated. A coalition is strongest when its members can coordinate. It is weakest when they begin thinking about what comes after victory. What would happen to York if the English were defeated? Who would control the city? Would Scotland expand? Would Strathclyde gain territory? Would Olaf become the dominant Scandinavian ruler in northern Britain? Would the raiders simply take what they could and leave? Those questions could have divided the coalition. But none of them needed to be answered before the first objective was achieved. First, Æthelstan had to be defeated. That was the immediate problem. The longer-term disagreements could wait. This is a common feature of balancing coalitions. A dominant power can create temporary unity among rivals precisely because each member fears that refusing cooperation will leave it alone against the stronger opponent. The coalition does not have to be stable. It only has to survive long enough to fight. For Æthelstan, that meant something important had changed. His opponents were no longer constrained by their rivalries with one another. Those rivalries still existed, but the immediate threat from England had become large enough to override them. This is why the coalition should not be described simply as an expression of hatred toward England. It was a strategic calculation. Æthelstan's victories had altered the cost of resistance. And once the cost of resistance alone became too high, coordination became worthwhile. That was the unintended consequence of his success. He had spent years making England stronger by defeating rivals one at a time. Those defeats removed individual threats, but they also taught the surviving rivals a lesson. They could not afford to remain isolated. The logical response was to combine. And now the combined force was moving into England. In the summer of 937, Olaf crossed the Irish Sea with forces from Dublin and the wider Viking world. Northern forces moved south. The coalition converged on the Wirral. Their objective was clear: defeat Æthelstan and break his hold over the north. For the coalition, this was the moment when separate political grievances became a single military operation. For Æthelstan, it was the first time the consequences of his expansion had returned to him in concentrated form. The king had created an order in which multiple rulers were weaker individually. Now those rulers were combining their remaining strength. The result was an enemy force large enough to threaten the strategy that had produced Æthelstan's dominance in the first place. And when the English king reached the Wirral, he discovered just how much that coalition had changed the battlefield before the battle had even begun. He was heavily outnumbered. For the first time, Æthelstan's greatest advantage, his ability to impose the terms of the contest, was no longer guaranteed. The coalition had managed to change the problem. Now Æthelstan had to solve it. The coalition had achieved what Æthelstan's individual rivals had failed to achieve. It had changed the balance of the contest. For years, Æthelstan had usually been the side setting the terms. He chose when to campaign. He chose which rival to confront. He could impose oaths, demand tribute, and decide whether a subordinate ruler remained useful or became an enemy. Now those advantages were disappearing. The coalition had brought the war to him. In the summer of 937, Olaf's forces crossed the Irish Sea while the northern armies moved south. Their objective was not simply to raid English territory and retreat. They wanted to force Æthelstan into a decisive confrontation that could break his hold over the north. For Æthelstan, the first problem was information. How large was the invading force? Where would it concentrate? How quickly could his own forces assemble? And, most importantly, could he afford to fight immediately? The answer to the last question was clearly uncertain. The transcript describes Æthelstan as discovering that he was heavily outnumbered. We do not know the exact numbers of either side, and later estimates are uncertain, but the strategic problem is clear. The coalition possessed enough mass to make an immediate English attack dangerous. This was precisely the kind of situation that tests a commander's ability to manage time. A weaker army does not necessarily need to win the first engagement. It may need to avoid losing it. That distinction gave Æthelstan another option: delay. According to the surviving tradition recorded in the transcript, Æthelstan ordered many more tents to be constructed than his army actually needed. The purpose was simple: prevent enemy scouts from accurately judging the size of the English force. This was not battlefield strength. It was information management. The coalition knew it had an advantage. Æthelstan wanted to make that advantage harder to measure. At the same time, he opened negotiations with Olaf. The English king offered silver in exchange for the Viking ruler abandoning his allies and accepting peace. Olaf considered the proposal seriously enough to discuss it with his war chiefs, and negotiations continued instead of immediately producing a battle. At first glance, this might look like weakness. Why offer money if the objective is victory? Because the value of negotiation is not always the treaty itself. Sometimes the value is time. Each day that the two camps negotiated was another day in which Æthelstan could increase his forces. The diplomatic exchange, therefore, became part of the military operation. The silver mattered, but the clock mattered more. Olaf and his commanders knew that fighting immediately offered them a major numerical advantage. Æthelstan knew that time could change that advantage. So neither side was negotiating purely for peace. They were competing over the conditions under which the eventual battle would occur. The talks continued. One side asked for terms. The other responded. Olaf demanded more silver. Æthelstan revised his position. The negotiations stretched on for days. And while the envoys argued, the military balance was changing. English reinforcements arrived, gradually reducing the numerical advantage that had initially made the coalition so dangerous. This is a critical moment because it shows that Brunanburh was not determined solely by what happened when the armies finally met. The battle was being shaped before the first shield was raised. Æthelstan was using diplomacy as a battlefield tool. He was using deception to influence enemy information. And he was using delay to alter the relative strength of the two forces. The coalition, meanwhile, faced a different problem. Its biggest advantage was time-sensitive. Every day spent waiting gave England an opportunity to improve its position. The longer the negotiations continued, the less attractive the coalition's initial advantage became. Eventually, Æthelstan's position strengthened enough for him to impose terms that the coalition could not accept without abandoning its objective. Olaf would have to leave England. He would have to compensate for the damage his raids had caused. And he would have to accept Æthelstan's overlordship. Those were not terms for equality. They were terms designed to restore the political order that had existed before the invasion. Olaf now faced a choice. He could withdraw without achieving his objective, or he could fight. By this point, the strategic value of immediate battle had changed. The coalition no longer enjoyed the same overwhelming advantage it had possessed when Æthelstan first arrived. But withdrawal meant accepting the failure of the invasion. The coalition therefore chose battle. At Brunanburh, two political systems that had been developing in opposite directions were finally forced into direct confrontation. On one side was an increasingly centralized English kingdom under a ruler who had spent more than a decade expanding his influence through conquest, diplomacy, and overlordship. On the other was a temporary coalition whose members had very different interests but one shared strategic objective: break that expansion. The battlefield would determine which system could convert its available capabilities into effective collective action. And that is why the decision-making before the battle matters so much. Æthelstan did not simply discover a stronger army on the morning of Brunanburh. He created better conditions for using the army he had. He could not eliminate the coalition. He could not control its initial strength. But he could change the information it received, delay the moment of contact, and give his own reinforcements time to arrive. The coalition, in turn, had succeeded in forcing England into a fight that would not have occurred on the same terms if its members had continued operating separately. Both sides had therefore already changed the battlefield before they reached it. Now they had one final problem to solve. The coalition had to break an English army that had been given time to prepare. Æthelstan had to turn that preparation into a decisive victory. Tomorrow would bring the clash, and after years of political expansion, the question would finally be answered in steel. The coalition had achieved its immediate objective. Æthelstan had been forced onto the defensive. But forcing an enemy into battle is not the same as forcing him to fight on your preferred terms. That distinction now became decisive. When Æthelstan reached the Wirral and realized how large the invading coalition appeared to be, he had a problem that could not be solved by courage alone. He needed time, he needed more men, and he needed to prevent the coalition from understanding exactly how weak his position was. The first part of the solution was deception. According to the tradition preserved in the transcript, Æthelstan ordered far more tents to be erected than his army actually required. From a distance, the additional tents could make the English camp appear substantially larger than it really was, potentially discouraging an immediate attack or at least complicating the enemy's assessment of English strength. This is a small detail, but strategically it reveals something important. Æthelstan was no longer simply trying to overpower the coalition. He was trying to manipulate what the coalition believed about the battlefield. Information had become a weapon. The second part of the plan was negotiation. Æthelstan's envoys approached Olaf with an offer of silver in exchange for abandoning his allies and accepting peace. Olaf did not simply reject the offer. He discussed it with his war chiefs and returned with a demand for more silver. The two sides continued bargaining. On the surface, this looks like diplomacy delaying a battle. But the strategic logic was more interesting. Every day of negotiation had a military consequence. Æthelstan was waiting for reinforcements. Olaf was trying to preserve his advantage. Neither side could know exactly how the balance would change while the negotiations continued. The silver therefore had two possible values. It could become the price of peace, or it could become the price of time. For Æthelstan, time was the more important asset. The longer the coalition waited, the more opportunity England had to bring additional forces north. That was especially important because the coalition's greatest strength was numerical concentration. Its members had joined because together they could achieve something they could not easily achieve alone. But coalition strength also carried a hidden weakness. A coalition becomes less valuable if the moment of concentration passes. The longer it remains in position, the greater the opportunity for its opponent to gather strength, improve defenses, and separate its members from their original advantage. Æthelstan therefore did not need to defeat the coalition immediately. He needed to prevent it from defeating him immediately. That difference transformed the way the campaign had to be fought. He had already used political leverage before the invasion. Now he was using deception and negotiation as extensions of military strategy. This is why the period before Brunanburh deserves almost as much attention as the battle itself. The battle was not simply waiting to happen. Both sides were actively shaping the conditions under which it would happen. And gradually the conditions changed. The negotiations dragged on for more than a week. During that time, English reinforcements arrived. The numerical imbalance that had initially favored the coalition narrowed. Æthelstan's army was approaching a position from which it could fight without accepting the coalition's original advantage. The coalition now faced its own decision problem: continue negotiating and risk losing its military advantage, withdraw and abandon the campaign, or fight before the balance changed further. There was another difficulty. Olaf and the other coalition leaders had not entered England simply to secure a compromise. Their strategic objective was to reverse Æthelstan's expansion. That meant peace on English terms was not really a victory. Eventually, the negotiations reached their limit. Æthelstan demanded that Olaf leave England, compensate the damage caused by the invasion, and submit to his overlordship. The terms reveal the political stakes of the campaign. Æthelstan was not merely trying to survive. He was trying to restore the hierarchy he had created before the invasion. Olaf was being asked to accept the very political order he had crossed the Irish Sea to destroy, so the choice became unavoidable. The coalition could accept defeat without a battle, or it could gamble everything on one. It chose the second. By then, however, Æthelstan had changed the conditions. He had concealed the apparent size of his force. He had delayed the engagement. He had used diplomacy to consume time. He had allowed reinforcements to arrive. And he had forced the coalition to make its final decision after its initial numerical advantage had weakened. This does not mean the English king had already won. Nothing about the final battle was guaranteed. The coalition still possessed substantial forces. Its members had succeeded in concentrating power against England. And once the armies met, every advantage gained through negotiation would have to be converted into battlefield performance. But the strategic contest had already shifted. The coalition had wanted to force Æthelstan into an immediate fight while the odds were favorable. Æthelstan had refused to accept those terms. He had turned time into a weapon, and by the time the two sides finally agreed to fight, the battle they were about to enter was no longer the same battle the coalition had envisioned when it first crossed into England. That is the crucial lesson of the prelude to Brunanburh. Victory would not belong simply to the side with the larger initial force. It would belong to the side that could better manipulate the conditions of contact. At dawn, the two armies would finally move toward one another. Shield walls would form, missiles would fly, and every political calculation made during the previous weeks would collapse into one physical contest. Whether the coalition could convert coordination into battlefield cohesion before Æthelstan's army broke it apart. The battle began on a morning when the political calculations of the previous months finally became physical. Across the field near Brunanburh, two very different coalitions were preparing to test one another. Æthelstan's army had survived the coalition's attempt to catch it at a numerical disadvantage. The delay had given the English king time to gather additional forces. Now he had to make those advantages matter. The exact size of either army is unknown. Later estimates place both forces in the thousands, but the surviving evidence does not allow us to give a reliable, precise figure. What is much clearer is that the battle was exceptionally large by the standards of 10th century Britain and brought together warriors from several political communities. That diversity shaped the battlefield. Æthelstan divided his army into two main forces. On one side, Mercians faced Olaf's forces. On the other, West Saxons prepared to confront the Scottish contingent under Constantine. The coalition therefore had to coordinate different forces operating against different parts of the English line. That arrangement offered strength. It also created a potential weakness. The more complicated the battlefield became, the more difficult coordination became. The opening exchange was violent. The armies advanced toward one another and formed shield walls. Wood and metal locked together. Before the lines collided, missiles filled the space between them. Arrows, spears, rocks. Then the distance disappeared. The shield walls struck. The battle ceased to be a contest of maneuver in the open field and became a struggle of pressure, endurance, and local advantage. Men pushed into one another's formations. Spearmen searched for gaps. Axemen struck at exposed shield bearers. And because the two sides were so closely matched, neither immediately collapsed. This is important because the coalition had already solved one major strategic problem. It had created enough concentrated strength to prevent Æthelstan from simply overwhelming one opponent after another. Now it had to solve a different problem. Could that strength remain coherent under sustained pressure? Coalitions can look powerful on a map. Battlefields are less forgiving. The members of a coalition still have different commanders. They still have different formations. And once casualties begin mounting, the incentives that held them together can weaken. At Brunanburh, the fighting continued for hours. The front lines absorbed repeated attacks. Neither side could simply bypass the other. The battlefield itself constrained movement, with streams and rising ground shaping the space in which the armies could maneuver. That turned the contest into one of attrition and local breakthroughs. Eventually, the pressure began to tell. Olaf's shield wall started to crack. That moment was decisive. A formation does not need to lose every soldier to become ineffective. It only needs enough gaps to lose cohesion. Once a breach opens, soldiers who were previously protected by the collective strength of the line suddenly become exposed. And once the formation loses its shape, an enemy can begin turning a local success into a wider collapse. That is what Æthelstan's army did. English forces pushed through the broken sections. The fighting remained deadly, but the balance was beginning to move. The coalition's different components were no longer operating as one stable battlefield system. The Norwegian forces weakened. Their commanders were killed. The pressure intensified, and the political diversity that had been a source of strength during the invasion became a liability once coordination began to fail. The battle was therefore being decided by more than courage. It was a test of collective organization. The coalition had succeeded strategically by concentrating power. But concentrated power is only useful if it can remain coordinated after contact with the enemy. At Brunanburh, that coordination began to break apart. The English army kept applying pressure. The coalition's formations became increasingly disorganized. And once the main line collapsed, the consequences spread quickly. The loss of major commanders accelerated the breakdown. The Scots and Britons, seeing the Norwegian forces disintegrate, recognized that the battle was moving beyond recovery. They withdrew. The remaining Norse forces also began retreating toward their ships. The battlefield had answered the central military question. The coalition could bring together a larger and more diverse force than any individual northern kingdom could field against England. But it could not maintain that collective advantage once the fighting became a prolonged test of cohesion. That is the key difference between coalition formation and coalition effectiveness. The alliance had solved the problem of concentration. Brunanburh exposed the problem of coordination. And once coordination failed, the numerical advantage that had created the coalition's original confidence stopped mattering in the same way. The casualties were enormous by the standards of the period, although exact totals remain unknown. Several important rulers and commanders were killed. Olaf escaped. Constantine survived but lost his son and many of his leading men. Æthelstan and his brother Edmund held the field. The English king had won the battle, but the significance of the victory needs to be measured carefully. Æthelstan had not simply won a battlefield. He had destroyed the immediate coalition assembled to challenge his northern dominance. That was a major strategic achievement. The political system he had built had survived its greatest military stress test. England had not been broken. York had not been recovered by Olaf, and the coalition had failed in its central objective. But victory did not mean the problem had disappeared. The English army had suffered heavily. The fighting had consumed so much of its strength that Æthelstan could not immediately launch another major campaign north. The northern kingdoms had been defeated. They had not been erased. And that distinction would become increasingly important after the battlefield fell silent. Brunanburh had demonstrated that Æthelstan could defeat a coalition. It had not demonstrated that he could permanently remove the political incentives that had created that coalition. That was the limit of battlefield victory. The coalition had been broken. The underlying political problem remained. And that is why Brunanburh should be understood not as the moment when every northern rival surrendered forever, but as the moment when Æthelstan's expanding system proved capable of surviving its greatest coordinated challenge. The king had won, but the north was not finished. Brunanburh had achieved what Æthelstan needed most. The coalition was broken. Olaf had been driven back toward Ireland. Constantine had lost heavily. The Northern Alliance that had marched south to overturn English dominance had failed to achieve its objective. From the battlefield, the result looked decisive. Æthelstan had defended his kingdom. He had defeated the combined forces of some of the most important rulers in northern Britain. And he had preserved the political system he had spent a decade building. But military victory and political settlement are not the same thing. The battle had destroyed the coalition. It had not destroyed the reasons the coalition had formed. That distinction is easy to miss because the immediate outcome was so dramatic. The English army had held the field. Several enemy rulers and commanders were dead. The invasion had failed. The possibility of Olaf recovering York through force had collapsed. For the moment, Æthelstan's position was stronger than it had been when the coalition first crossed into England. But the price had been high. The English army itself had suffered enormous losses. The battle had been so destructive that Æthelstan could not immediately turn victory into another major campaign against the northern kingdoms. That mattered, because if military power is what sustains political control, then an army too exhausted to continue campaigning cannot immediately convert victory into deeper conquest. Æthelstan had won the battle, but he had not gained the capacity to keep marching north forever. This was the first limitation of Brunanburh. The second was political. Scotland and Strathclyde had been defeated in the field. They had not ceased to exist as independent political communities. They still possessed rulers. They still possessed territory. And they still possessed their own interests. The battle had therefore changed their position. It had not erased it. This is why the phrase Brunanburh created England is useful only if it is handled carefully. The English kingdom already existed before the battle. Æthelstan had built much of its political structure through consolidation, conquest, diplomacy, tribute, and overlordship. Brunanburh demonstrated that this emerging kingdom could survive a major coordinated challenge. It strengthened Æthelstan's position. It made the cost of immediately challenging England even higher, and it shattered the particular coalition that had assembled in 937. But it did not permanently remove northern resistance. Modern scholarship emphasizes that the gains of Æthelstan's reign in the north were more fragile than the scale of the victory might suggest. A similar alliance could reappear soon after his death, and York would again become contested. That tells us something fundamental about the political system. Æthelstan had solved the immediate military problem. He had not solved the underlying incentive structure. Olaf still had reasons to seek power in York. Scottish rulers still had reasons to defend independence. Northern elites still had reasons to prefer local authority over distant English overlordship. A battlefield can destroy an army, cannot automatically destroy those incentives. And that is where the significance of Brunanburh becomes more interesting. The battle was not simply a victory over a foreign invasion. It was a demonstration of the limits and capabilities of English expansion. Æthelstan had shown that England could survive when several northern powers coordinated against it. That mattered enormously. It changed what those rulers could reasonably expect from a direct confrontation with the English king. But it also showed that maintaining northern supremacy required continued military and political effort. Victory created security. It also created responsibility. The English crown now had to preserve the order it had won. That meant maintaining the loyalty of northern rulers. It meant preventing new alliances from forming. It meant retaining enough military capacity to punish renewed rebellion if necessary. And it meant ensuring that the political relationships Æthelstan had created survived beyond the battlefield. In other words, Brunanburh did not end the strategic problem, changed its form. Before the battle, the question was, can England survive a coalition? After the battle, the question became, can England preserve the political order that victory has produced? Those are different questions. And the second one would prove more difficult than the first, because battlefield victory depends primarily on what armies can do once. Political control depends on what rulers, institutions, and subjects continue doing afterward. Æthelstan's achievement, therefore, needs to be measured on both levels. Militarily, he had succeeded. Strategically, he had strengthened England's position. Politically, however, the settlement remained conditional. And there was one final variable that could test that condition more severely than any foreign army. The man who had built the system would not rule forever. Æthelstan's reign was approaching its end. And when he disappeared, the political relationships that had held the North in place would have to survive without him. That would reveal whether Brunanburh had produced a durable settlement, or only a powerful ruler's temporary dominance. Brunanburh had answered the immediate question. Æthelstan could defeat a coalition. He could survive a coordinated invasion. And he could preserve the English political order he had spent more than a decade constructing. But the battle had never been the only test. The deeper test was whether that order could continue to function after the king who created it was gone. Æthelstan's achievement had been extraordinary. He inherited a kingdom whose unity had only recently been secured. He conquered York. He imposed obligations on northern rulers. He expanded English influence across Britain. He developed alliances with powerful rulers beyond the island. And when the northern powers finally combined against him, he defeated them at Brunanburh. But none of those achievements changed one basic political fact. Æthelstan was still the center of the system. His authority held together relationships that were not necessarily based on permanent agreement. Northern rulers had submitted because English power was credible. They attended councils because refusing carried consequences. They paid tribute because the king could enforce his demands. They accepted his overlordship because resisting alone was dangerous. That system could function extremely well while Æthelstan remained capable of enforcing it. The question was what would happen when someone else inherited the crown. By 939, that question arrived sooner than the political system might have wanted. Æthelstan died at Gloucester after 15 years of rule. He left no sons. His brother Edmund was quickly accepted as his successor by the royal council at Winchester. The succession itself was not the immediate disaster that had followed Edward the Elder's death. But the northern problem returned. The territories that had submitted to Æthelstan had not necessarily become permanently integrated into a single English political identity. Their loyalty had been secured under a ruler whose military reputation was formidable and whose victories were recent. Under a new king, the calculation could change. And it did. The transcript describes the north as less trustworthy after Æthelstan's death, noting that earlier loyalty had been extracted through a combination of fear and respect for his military power. That observation points back to the entire story. Æthelstan's expansion had changed the political structure of Britain. Brunanburh had defended that structure, but the battle had not eliminated the reasons northern rulers might prefer independence. Those incentives had simply been suppressed by Æthelstan's success. His death removed the strongest force suppressing them. This is why the aftermath of Brunanburh matters so much. If the battle had truly eliminated the northern problem, then Æthelstan's death should not have reopened it. But it did. The question was no longer whether England could win one great battle. It was whether the political system could turn victory into something durable enough to survive a change of ruler. That is a much harder problem. Military power can defeat an army, cannot automatically create political loyalty. A victorious king can compel submission. He cannot guarantee that the next king will receive the same obedience. A treaty can define obligations. It cannot erase the interests of the people who accepted those obligations. And a defeated coalition can disappear from the battlefield while the political forces that created it remain. That is exactly what makes Brunanburh so important. The battle was a tremendous success for Æthelstan, but its greatest historical significance lies in what it reveals about the process of state formation. England was becoming stronger. Its institutions were expanding. Its rulers were projecting power farther north. But the kingdom was still being held together through a combination of military capability, political relationships, diplomacy, and the authority of individual kings. That made Æthelstan's reign a turning point, not because England was suddenly created on one battlefield, and not because every northern rival was permanently defeated, but because the English kingdom demonstrated that it could survive a coalition large enough to threaten the entire political structure Æthelstan had built. Brunanburh proved that the system had military strength. The aftermath showed that military strength alone was not enough to make the system irreversible. That distinction brings the entire story back to its beginning. When Edward the Elder died, the possibility of political fragmentation was real. Æthelstan responded by consolidating power. He then expanded that power northward. His victories reduced the independence of neighboring rulers. Those rulers adapted by forming a coalition. The coalition challenged Æthelstan. Æthelstan adapted again by buying time, manipulating information, gathering reinforcements, and finally defeating the combined army. At that point, it would have been easy to assume the problem was solved. But the political system was never simply a battlefield. Its enemies still existed. Its northern kingdoms still existed. Its rival dynasties still existed. And when Æthelstan died, the authority holding those relationships together became less secure. That is the deeper lesson of the battle. Success changes the behavior of everyone around the successful power. Æthelstan's victories made England stronger. They also made cooperation among England's rivals more valuable. Brunanburh was the resulting collision. England won, but the victory did not erase the political logic that had produced the coalition. It only demonstrated that Æthelstan could defeat it, and that is why the battle should not be remembered simply as the moment that created England. England had already been taking shape. Brunanburh was the moment when that emerging kingdom was tested by the combined forces of the powers that feared its expansion most. Æthelstan passed the military test. The harder historical question was whether the political order he had built could survive the loss of the man who had made it so formidable. The North would soon provide the answer. And that is where the real significance of Brunanburh lies. Æthelstan proved that England could defeat a coalition. He did not prove that England had permanently eliminated the reasons for one to form again.